Greetings, this is Steve with the Sunday Stoic podcast. I am reissuing a episode where I interviewed Dr. Kevin Vost. Kevin just passed away, and I wanted to share this episode again in his honor. Kevin was a devout Catholic, a practicing Stoic, a bodybuilder, father, etc. He was a very intelligent man, an author of many books, and always a pleasure to talk to. I had him on 2 episodes, one where we discussed Stoicism and Christianity, and another episode where we discussed memorizing the Stoics. He was a big believer in the power of memory, in honing our memory and using techniques to memorize things instead of always looking them up. And his book is very powerful. I was able to memorize the themes to every chapter of the Enchiridion, for example, using his technique. So you can check that episode out on your own as well, but I wanted to re-release this episode in Kevin's memory. One day, we all pass the same way, but we should remember the good ones. Carpe diem.
Wisdom,
Prudentia,
justice,
Justitia,
temperance,
Temperantia,
courage.
Fortitudo.
Applying ancient philosophy to modern life, this is the Sunday Stoic.
Today's guest is Dr. Kevin Vost. He received his PhD from the Adler School of Professional Psychology in Chicago. He has taught gerontology and psychology at several universities. He's the author of, I'm just going to say, bushels of books. Dr. Vost, how many books have you written? Do you know?
I do know. I've written 20, but the 20th I don't have yet. I believe it's actually in the mail, the last one.
So at least 20 books on Catholicism, apologetics, saints' biographies, spiritual growth and physical fitness, and more. He has served as a research review committee member for American Mensa, and today he joins us to discuss his book, The Porch and the Cross, Ancient Stoic Wisdom for Modern Christian Living. Dr. Vost, welcome to the podcast.
It's my pleasure to be with you today, Steve. Thanks so much for having me.
So would you mind telling us a bit more about yourself? That was a very short biography, and how you yourself discovered the philosophy of Stoicism.
Sure. To make a 58-year-long story short, I was a person who I grew up Central Illinois, Springfield, Illinois, the land of Abraham Lincoln. I was raised in the Catholic religion. As a teenager, I was obsessed with the world of bodybuilding and muscle building and strength training, which I wouldn't call myself obsessed, but I still very much a fan and a practitioner to this day. In my late teens, I got very immersed in philosophy, especially atheistic philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche, Ayn Rand, Bertrand Russell, and others. Went through about a 25-year time frame where I considered myself an atheist until my early 40s, when, partly influenced by a line from the Stoic philosopher Seneca, I found myself, working my way back to faith, finding it reasonable, and becoming a Christian again. Along this whole journey, both as an atheist and since in my return to the faith, I was enamored with the Stoics, the power, the beauty, the philosophy of the ancient Greek Stoics, primarily through most of those years, the writings of Epictetus and Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. And in recent years, I've also discovered the remaining fragments of Musonius Rufus. We could flesh out it if you like, but I will just say that the Stoics have had a big impact on my life for about 40 years now.
Now, do you recall what that line from Seneca was that changed your trajectory?
I sure do. If I can give you my sloppy Latin, nihil minus est homini occupati quam vivere, which would be the busy man is least busied with living. Okay, it was a statement from his essay on the shortness of life. And at that point in my life, I was extremely busy. I was working full-time, doing college teaching part-time. I realized I had no time to reflect. That Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living.
Right.
So that line really hit me. I started saying no. I turned away from some of my overabundant obligations and had time to reflect and think about things deeply again, including the writings of the Stoics. And it wasn't for like within a year after that I wrote the first of these many books. Once I had leisure, could devote myself to philosophy, it wasn't too long until I wanted to start to share that. So it was really a monumental thing, that insight that really hit me from Seneca.
Well, one of the questions I was going to ask last, I'll just move up in line here to first. So based on that idea that the of being too busy and not living, what do you do? How do you organize your life in such a way that you can write so prolifically? How do you find time for that?
Well, I must admit, I have a big advantage right now since I'm retired from full-time employment. But actually, though, most of my writing was done while I worked full-time in the field of disability evaluation for Social Security. We did mental and physical disability evaluation. And at times then, too, occasionally I did some part-time college teaching. But at the time I was fully employed and writing books, the main benefit for me was that I'm just by nature a very early riser.
Okay.
Like my dad, by 4 a.m. or something, I'm up and I'm full of energy.
So you're an 8 o'clock mass guy.
Yes. Oh yeah. We're the earliest one we can get to. So yeah. So I always had a lot of energy in the morning, and I would start with my coffee, reading my Stoics or St. Thomas Aquinas, whatever I was writing on at the time. So that's how I did it. I did it when I had high energy, usually before I went to work.
Okay. It's just interesting to see how some of us go years and produce very little, and others in the same amount of time seem to be living normal lives, but yet produce quite a abundance of material. So that's pretty impressive.
And it's a different timing. I was really 45 years old before I started writing all these books in sequence.
Oh, good. There's hope for me yet. Thank you. Now, let's set the stage. Stoicism starts, let's just say, roughly 300 BC in Greece, and came to Rome around 155 BC, at least the first inklings of it, as far as we understand. So I have listeners from all over the world. A lot of them are in the U.S. and are probably pretty familiar with Christianity in general. But could you set the stage of how Christianity spread and when it started to really influence that part of the world?
Yeah, well, of course, in the classic Western way of doing dates, we do BC before Christ and AD Anno Domino. So about roughly 2019 years ago, Christ was born. Some say it may have been actually a few years, 3 or 4 years before that. The early Christians, the great Christian writers, St. Paul, the evangelists who wrote the Gospels of Christ, they're living, of course, in the 1st century AD. Some people have pointed out that this is also the time, yes, that some of our great Roman moralists are actively preaching the Stoic philosophy. At the same time, in the 1st century, the 2nd century AD, people like Musonius Rufus, Epictetus' teacher. Seneca was born virtually the same year as Christ, the great Roman Latin writer. Epictetus was also 1st, 2nd century. So a lot of intertwining influences there. It's not really clear. I'm not an expert in this area, but I know people have written about the intersecting Stoic thoughts that we can find in St. Paul. Some of his letters seem to have very, very Stoic themes there. So he was well versed in them. There was a lot of interchange there. There used to be this apocryphal group of letters that was correspondence between Seneca and St. Paul that was later found to be apocryphal. But we do know that Seneca's actual biological brother is mentioned in our New Testament in the books of Acts. He refused to hear a case against St. Paul. So all kinds of intertwining influences there. Most people believe, the main books of the Bible, the canon, what goes in the Bible, wasn't really established till around, I think, the year 300 AD or so. But some Christian ideas, of course, were still known or beginning to be known in the early years of Stoic philosophy. And I'll also say that early in the history of the Christian church, many of these profound thinkers, Christian thinkers at the time, had classical education. So many of the early Christian theologians were, fairly well versed in Stoic and, Platonic and Aristotelian and a variety of Greco-Roman ideas. So So Greek and Roman philosophy, including prominently the Stoics, also helped to shape to some extent, the way Christianity developed.
Could you introduce our listeners to St. Thomas Aquinas and perhaps how the Stoics may have influenced him, and then what his role is in Christianity?
Sure. St. Thomas Aquinas lived in the 13th century, approximately the year 1225 to 1274. His teacher was a man, St. Albert the Great, who is considered the greatest scientist of his time and also a great philosopher and theologian. And St. Thomas has had a huge impact in my life. I'm a Roman Catholic. At the time he wrote was before the Reformation. He's kind of a common heritage of all Christians. And the remarkable thing about Thomas is he was a tremendous respecter of not only the Christian faith, but of the value of human reason. So he was a great synthesizer of knowledge. So he cites not only scripture and Christian theologians, but he cites pagan philosophers. He cites Aristotle and Plato and Cicero and Seneca. He cites Jewish thinkers and Arab thinkers and so on. But one of the greatest intertwinings between the Stoics and St. Thomas I found is the way he explicitly cites and pulls from the Stoic philosopher Seneca in at least three main places in Thomas's great, massive 3,000-page work, the Summa Theologica. One, when he talks about the human passion of anger, he borrows a lot from Seneca, who wrote a whole book on anger. In another section, Thomas is talking about the virtue of temperance or self-control. He cites a lot from Seneca on a related virtue of clemency, on how we moderate, how we punish other people or take revenge. But I think the most glorious use that Thomas made of the Stoic thought was when he talks about the virtue of gratitude and how it relates to the virtue of justice, paying people what they're due. Now, if you go through Thomas, it's a classic section. He cites Aristotle, St. Augustine, the scripture, all kinds of church fathers. But when talking about gratitude, the person he cites the most often and most explicit detail is actually Seneca. The nobility of those ideas of being thankful to God, thankful to other people, how you properly express that. So that's one reason St. Thomas has such a special role for me. He's a person who integrated faith and reason, and he's a person who integrated my two favorite systems of philosophy, those of the Stoics and of Aristotle.
Wow. So if we're going to read, you have some books about St. Thomas Aquinas, correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So if we wanted to begin a trek in that direction to find out more, we could start with some of your writings and then work our way up to that massive tome if we're brave enough, right?
Yeah, that would be great. In fact, the book most relevant, I wrote a book called The 1 Minute Aquinas, which attempts to summarize the highlights of that 3,000-page Summa Theologica in about 300 pages, in modern language and with
okay, great.
jargon.
So we've set kind of the stage. These two systems, a religion and a philosophy, have crossed paths and influenced, at least one's influenced the other. Probably if we knew more, we could see how they influenced each other. But what are some Stoic practices then that you have found integrate well into Christianity or the practice of Catholicism?
Okay, well, for me, my first profound insight and aha about the Stoics was in my late teens. And I discovered them through a man who happened to be an atheist, Albert Ellis, the founder of rational emotive therapy. As a psychology student, I learned that Ellis credited insights from Epictetus as the basis of his therapy. Aaron Beck, a psychiatrist who founded cognitive therapy, also credited an insight from Epictetus. And that main insight is in Epictetus' little handbook, the 5th little chapter. And it says that people are disturbed not by things, but by the views they take of things. One of the fundamental Stoic insights that goes along with the idea that some things are within our control, some things are not within our control. We need to focus what we can control. And to some people, it might be a bit of a surprise. One thing that we can train ourselves to control is our emotional reaction to outside events. So to me, that became kind of like the key driving idea. I sometimes say how, like, when I was young, I had a tremendous fear of public speaking. My face would turn beet red. I have a ruddy complexion to begin with. My heart would pound. My voice would falter. And it was through reading Ellis and the Stoics that I was able to totally overcome that fear. just by kind of like thinking, well, what if all these things go wrong? If I spit on the audience and I realize my zipper's down and all this, well, so what?
I've done all those things. If anyone
you've done all those things too.
And I had the same issue with my first public speaking. We'll go way back. Was when I was a kid reading at Catholic Mass when you had to do the readings, and I was shaking, and that was, and then it didn't get better for a long time. It took a while to get to where I could talk in front of a group and not have the same symptoms you're speaking of.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It varies. I believe even Cicero said that sometimes he would, one of the greatest speakers of all history, said he would get a little anxious before speaking. But the biggest talk I had to do in college, I used that idea that, so what? Maybe I'm the worst speaker in the world, but somebody's got to be. It could be me, big deal. And I also did what Ellis called a shame attacking exercise, which is that's actually also a reference to this in the life of Zeno, in Diogenes Laertius' life of Zeno, the founder of the Stoics.
Yeah.
It's like his teacher, Crates the Cynic, made him go around town carrying this big bowl of lentil soup. And he saw that Musonius was embarrassed by this ridiculous thing he was doing. And when he saw that when he saw that Zeno was embarrassed and tried to hide the bowl, it says he took his staff, cracked open the bowl, it spilled all over the front of him, and Zeno ran away. And he said, "What are you running from, you little Phoenician? Nothing terrible has befallen you." So that idea that you make something shameful happen, you realize it's not the end of the world. So that pivotal talk for me, I got up there and I told the class, in a psychology class, I said, "I'm sorry if I turn beet red, if you can see me sweating, if my voice cracks, this kind of thing scares me to death. So please, I ask your forgiveness in advance." And then I just got on with it, And it worked. And I never really became nervous since then. And I realized too, Epictetus himself talks about this in the discourses. He says, if you decide you want to be a speaker or have, say things out in public, ask yourself, what do you want? Do you want praise from other people, or do you want to try to do good? And he said the correct approach would be you want to try to do good.
Right.
And in modern psychological terminology, we talk about being either ego-oriented or ego-driven. Oh, look at the focus is on me, or task-oriented or task-driven. And that was an important Stoic lesson that I tried to apply. If I have to give a talk, I'll do my best to prepare. And maybe I'll flop. Maybe people won't like it, but I can't control that.
Right.
All I can control is trying to do my best. So lessons like that when I was a young man, it just made a profound difference to me.
I've had similar thought processes before I discovered Stoicism, when I decided to scare myself into performing at open mic nights with a guitar, right? Like this might not go well, but all I can do is focus on my end of the bargain and do the best I can. And that, I think that helped me to kind of break through that barrier of public speaking. And then, of course, once I started teaching, you do it every day.
Yes, exactly. That practice, virtual, like Aristotle said, we become builders by builders and harpists by playing the harp. We become speakers by speaking, and by loving and focusing on what we're going to talk about, right?
Sure.
I imagine your passion for biology comes through in those talks, in lectures, I'm sure.
I do my best. Now, so there's one way that a Christian, or really anyone of any faith, could apply Stoicism to their lives. Are there any other ways of approaching that you'd like to discuss?
Oh, yes. And that incident, just one particular to me, but in general, that idea of that emotional control. The Stoics write a lot about our desires and passion. So from a Christian perspective, they have techniques that we can use to help curb our own vices and sins, to train ourselves. Their whole thing is, to become less focused on simple pleasures and more focused on things that matter, virtue, honesty, truth, and beauty. So if we practice these Stoic techniques, we can make ourselves much less susceptible to lust and desires and anger and all of the classic, deadly sins. So it's very, very practical if our goal is to live a more Christian life, because that's what these first and second century Greco-Roman Stoics were all about. Not philosophy, simply as a speculative endeavor, but as something that's going to shape the way we live our lives. So we live good lives, virtuous lives. So we become happy and we become most helpful and useful to other people all the while.
Yeah, the thing that appealed to me about Stoicism was its direct call to action. Basically, it's not think about whether a tree makes a sound in the forest kind of a thing. It's get out there and work on it. And I've heard some critique Stoicism from a Christian perspective, saying that they don't emphasize things like charity enough, for example. But from my view, it depends on how you look at it. If you think of the cosmopolis and your duty to your fellow humans, you could kind of consider justice and charity to be interrelated topics. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, if you're looking at charity as, the Christian theological virtue infused in us by God, well, they weren't Christians. They didn't know that. Mm-hmm. If you talk about, the idea of charity and just love for your fellow man, they were very, very strong in that. I mean, all of our major Stoics, you could cite examples. Seneca himself sometimes comes out very strongly. So every other person presents me with an opportunity for kindness. They talked about that this nobility of soul can be acquired by slaves, by a person in any station in life. They said that we should show nobility. I mean, show love and kindness and compassion to all people, whether they're a slave or a noble person. That idea that we're all tied together as human beings. Marcus Aurelius is really strong at this. We should never hate another person, he says, because we're kin to them. He says, not in terms of our seed or our blood, but because we all share in intelligence and in a spark of the divine. So in a sense, we're all brothers on a natural level. Some of the Stoics wrote about us being made in the image and likeness of God, as having intellects and wills unique among all the other creatures on earth. So in that regard, the Stoics aren't going to talk about charity in the same way Christians are. They didn't know of Christ or Christian theology. But I think they're very often some very, very loving and just elements reaching out towards others in Stoic thought. Now, some of the criticisms I've seen at times, some will say they may encourage pride. Like especially Seneca, there's certain lines in there. He says, when you use philosophy to develop self-control, he says, in some sense, you're becoming even more than a god because you're frail and you develop this power to be, undisturbed by anything. So some Christian writers have warned about Seneca and pride, but when I think at the deep level of pride, meaning a rejection of God in favor of your own will, I don't see that in the Stoics at all. Almost all the major Stoics, one of their main ideas is that we're going to follow nature or follow God, make our will conform to God's. Now, sometimes some of them, kind of viewed God as a part of nature or as infusing all of nature. So they don't have an exactly Christian concept there. But again, the fundamental idea is we're going to use our reason to follow God. So I don't see that a pride that rejects God is in any way a real component of the Stoic view of the world and God and the universe.
Sure. Are there any other issues? I guess let me just ask it as my patron Joel had several questions for you, and they were all very good, better than I will come up with on my own.
All right.
One of his questions was Stoicism and Christianity certainly have a lot of overlap, but what aspects have you found the most difficult to reconcile? So you mentioned one that some have had issues with. Have you had any others that you can think of?
Yes. Probably the one for me is the idea of suicide.
Okay. The open door, as they call it.
That's right. The open door. If you complain about how bad things are, the door's always open. You can take your own life. And they cite some, in some sense, noble examples. Cato did that, after he lost in his battle against Caesar. They talk about, one of them gives some examples of a slave boy who's being taken away for slavery, and he throws his head in the wheels of a car.
That was particularly gruesome.
Yeah, very gruesome. I think that was Seneca. He liked some of those gruesome examples. But things like that, Socrates, of course, was one of the great sages for the Stoics. And I don't know if you really say he committed suicide. He took that hemlock, but the Athenians had judged that was the penalty for his crime. Right. He didn't try to evade it. Now, none of the major Stoics themselves in this Greco-Roman period, like Epictetus didn't kill himself, Aurelius did not, Musonius Rufus did not. They weren't counseling this as something to do. Seneca, did open his own veins and took poison and went to a hot bath, but that was at the order of Nero Caesar. So in a sense, I'd say this idea of the nobility of suicide, as a Christian, I don't agree with that, but it's not something they were endorsing for people. It was special circumstances. They are far more focused on how to live your life. And I think it also went with the idea they're showing us that we should not fear death, which can be valid from different perspectives. But
Sure.
I think that was part of the reason. But that's just, one of the very few, concrete Stoic teachings that I'd say, no, I don't really subscribe to that.
I understand. Yeah. Now, he also asks, and you've touched on this, but the Stoic concept of God is different than what you'd find in, well, most of the major religions. Have you found it? Have you been able to relate to what they say, or do you find it off-putting? I guess would be a way to think about it.
Yeah, no, I can relate. And people even just sticking to Epictetus and Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. They write about the God or the gods in different ways. There's some polytheistic elements. They were Greeks and Romans. They knew that the pantheon of Greece and of Rome. So sometimes they'll mention Zeus and Apollo and so forth. At other times, they talk about God basically with a capital G, or Epictetus will use Zeus to represent, Theos or God. Aurelius talks that way sometimes. Sometimes, they're viewed as more a pantheist, equating God with nature rather than the creator of nature. I didn't even find that too off-putting, because according to, Christian thought, like in St. Thomas Aquinas, we say we don't believe God is nature, that God created nature, it's a creation, and yet God is everywhere within nature through his essence, presence, and power. So I'm not particularly, put off by these different various Stoic perspectives on God. They were not referring to revelation. They were doing the best they could acquire through human reason. But I will say, in many places, their descriptions of God are very Christian-like. Epictetus, talks about God as a father, talks about God as caring about our daily lives, saying that we should sing praises to him, that we should make our wills try to conform with God. Seneca has some similar sayings too. So yeah, in general, they weren't Christians. They had many different ways of looking at God. I didn't really find any of them off-putting, and some I found very inspirational and consistent with Christian thought.
Now, in that light, another question from Joel: do you get much opposition from Christians who see Stoicism as a pagan or anti-Christian philosophy, and then say, "Well, what are you doing talking about this? This is something we should be avoiding, not promoting"?
Yeah, now I love that question. It's a great question, and it actually has a happy answer, because I do know, I was writing and speaking in the Catholic world for a couple decades now, that like in my own books, if I make a perceived error or sometimes an actual error, people in general are not shy, in person or to send an email and to point that out. I know that in talking about the Christian and Catholic intersection with some other world religions, there are a lot of people with very strong mixed views. They're not my areas myself. I don't write or talk about like yoga or mindfulness, but many people have a problem with that. It's not my area of expertise. But I will say, in my writings on the Stoic, I have never had a personal comment. I've never had an email that was critical for saying, hey, what are you doing pulling these Stoics in? Of course, if they did that, I'd say, okay, so you're critical also then of, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, so many others. It's part of our tradition to accept truth wherever it is. And if I give a few interesting little highlights here.
Sure.
When my book, The Porch and the Cross, came out in 2016, I asked a few prominent Catholic writers, lay people, and priests if they would look the book over and give an endorsement. And I know one prominent Catholic writer said he had a friend who was a Christian, but in more of a fundamental sect that didn't really value human reason, And he said that this friend later told him that he discovered the Stoics, and he said he wasn't a Christian anymore. And this Catholic friend of mine said, I couldn't understand that. He said, but after I read your book, I did understand it. That there's so much nobility and goodness there in the Stoics that if you thought human reason was purely depraved and worthless, it's going to be quite an eye-opener, right? Mm-hmm. One of the young, very popular Catholic priests who was going to give me an endorsement, I remember he wrote me back and said he was just really intrigued by Epictetus. He's like, that is one cool dude. So in general, in my own particular case, no, I've never had backlash. I've had emails from deacons who want a bunch of copies of the book to share with their parishioners. I remember one wrote to me, he said, he's a Catholic. He said, but I also considered myself a minimalist. But he said, after reading your book, I think I'm really more of a Stoic. So I must say, personally, to date, I have had nothing but positive comments from my Christian readers about my use of the Stoics.
Excellent. Have you heard of from any other beyond Christianity? Have you yourself run into any talk of Muslim Stoics, etc., in your chats about Stoicism?
Yeah, now that's interesting because I find this very intriguing. I look at some of the modern Stoic websites, and now I'll be following podcasts like yours has come to my attention. And I do know there's a lot of intersection. I'll say from the start, if someone can correct me, and I hope they can correct me, I don't remember offhand a Muslim intersection there. I'm not sure, but I know there's a lot of writing on Buddhism, some common themes between Stoicism and Buddhism, and the whole mindfulness issue in philosophy, in psychology. Recently, I read an article about the different Confucian Chinese thinkers and their views of self-cultivation. There was a modern Stoicism article about this, and how there are strong parallels with the Stoics. So I actually picked up one of the sources, and I thought I'm really intrigued with these Chinese philosophers and some compatible ideas there. And one of the references was actually a book about Mencius, one of the Chinese philosophers, and how his ideas intersect with some of Thomas Aquinas. So just amazing intersections there. I do know, too, there was a Jesuit missionary from the 1600s, Father Matteo Ricci, who went to China. And one thing that he realized was he thought that many Confucian ideas had overlap with Epictetus's Enchiridion, his handbook. So he did a partial translation of Epictetus for the Chinese. So I will just say there's a lot of, interconnection of ideas here between different worldviews. And I'll say, too, I know there are plenty of agnostics out there, of atheists out there, of people who have a just scientific worldview or who are strongly influenced by Darwin, who are also very much immersed in Stoicism now. So I think it's an amazing thing about this philosophy. It can draw people together of such diverse religious views, political views, because at the core, these Stoic teachings are, common to humanity. If we embrace reason and truth and goodness, there's just so much there to offer everybody.
Well, that's what I found with this little podcast that I have. I have folks listening in Indonesia and Australia and Vienna, Austria, and Canada, and all over the U.S. And so I've heard from folks from different faiths, and I had one write to me the other day and said, "I'm one of your every Sunday heathen listeners, and thank you for giving me something to think about." And so it's you're right. It is a place where we can go and find a commonality where the world seems in a lot of ways to be all about dividing, and this is something that can bring folks together. I have not had the opportunity myself to go to a Stoicon or anything like that to actually see a bunch of Stoics in one place. Now, have you been participating in speaking at Stoic events?
Well, good question. As we're speaking today, my first will be 3 days from now. the Stoicon X in Milwaukee, Wisconsin will actually be my first experience. I'll be speaking. The title of my talk will be, 40 Years Under the Porch. Lessons Ancient Stoics Taught a Modern Psychologist. So there, my talk will be just the very different ways they impacted me, the different ways they impact people. So I think this is an exciting thing that people are getting together now at these Stoicons, throughout the world, forming different chapters. And it's a thing that I hope really grows because there's just so much good in the Stoics, so much of modern cognitive psychotherapies, so much to the Stoics, but a lot of modern psychologists and researchers, they're into that scientific, the scientific literature, which is in the therapeutic literature, which is good, but some of them don't dig deep and look at those ancient sources. And if they did, I think many would be wowed at the depth and the beauty of the Stoics, who preach really too, not only, controlling our emotion, achieving, not being disturbed and crazy, but just becoming more fully human, growing in virtue, growing in our capacity to fulfill all our abilities to help other people. There's just a world of good that can come to all people, regardless of religion or political view, if they learn more deeply and start to practice some of these Stoic ideas.
So, if someone wants to learn more about you, see what else what your other works have been, where could they go to do that?
Sure. Well, my own website's just drvost.com, just drvost.com. I will say my son and daughter-in-law have been maintaining that for me, and they've been very, very busy. My son's just completed a pharmacy program, so it's a little out of date, like all my books aren't there, but there's a comment box on the bottom. So if anyone want to ask me a question or send me a comment, please do that. I will respond. If you're interested in my books, my main publisher is called Sophia Institute Press. The one that did my Stoic book, The Portrait of the Cross, is called Angelico Press, but they're all on the major booksellers like Amazon and Barnes & Noble. So you could go there to my author page and get access to all my books.
Excellent. Before we go, let's switch gears for just a second and see if you have any advice to offer listeners that might have a Stoic bent to it on going from out of shape to in shape, because one of your other well, like we said, passions, quote unquote, yes. is physical fitness. Now, how did you get into that, and how do you maintain that? Because that takes discipline to do it when you don't want to, and building good habits and things. Do you have any advice on doing this?
Sure. Yeah. My interest in fitness and building up the body came from when I first saw Superman fly across the screen when I was 5 years old. And a few years later, I saw some Olympic weightlifters on TV when I was about in second grade. I think that's when I got my first little plastic barbell set. So I just always had a natural love for it. As far as doing it wisely, I found the Stoics of great help there. Scattered throughout their sayings, they use bodily analogies and sometimes actual bodily advice. So if people are interested, I wrote a little article called Show Me Your Shoulders, which is a quote from Epictetus, the Stoic workout, a couple years ago. That's on the Modern Stoicism site. I also wrote a book called Fit for Eternal Life about actual spiritual and physical fitness. It's for a Catholic publisher. But if you look at the back cover, it has a photo of 3 books surrounded by a jump rope. Those books are the Bible, Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, and Epictetus' Discourses. So even in that book, I'm peppering it with these Stoic ideas, which are basically this. We need to train ourselves in body and soul by teaching ourselves discipline of the body, how to endure hardships, proper physical exercise, and care for the body. It puts us in a better shape to take care of our spiritual things. We should spend some time focusing on the body, but not too much. And I just found the Stoics a great inspiration with practical ideas, actually, even on how to do that, and even on the value of it. There's one little line from Epictetus. He said, even though I can't be a Milo. Now, Milo was considered the father of weightlifting. He's this ancient Greek guy who, when he was little, he picked up a calf every day. And as the calf grew into a bull, Milo grew into a bull of a man, right? He's an undefeated Olympic wrestling champion for decades. But Epictetus says, well, just because I can't be Milo doesn't mean I won't take care of my body, and that could be a lesson to us too. We may never be a world champion in any sport or Mr. Universe, but we all do have an obligation to show proper care for our body. And that's yet another lesson you will find suffused throughout the writings of the Stoics, especially Epictetus and Seneca. And they also point out there are ways to do that don't take a whole lot of time. Small amounts of physical exercise, training for strength as little as once a week even, can have a significant impact on your bodily health and on the way you feel.
Well, I appreciate joining the podcast today. Is there anything else you'd like to tell our listeners about before we end our discussion?
Sure. Enough about me, probably too much. I will just say that I encourage anyone, probably most people here, have heard of the Stoics, but read them on a regular basis. Read the Stoics themselves. And there's all kinds of, modern day writers out there writing about them from different perspectives. Pick those up too. We're just really blessed to have a wealth of good information now. And also, of course, resources like your podcast and YouTube videos. It's well worth your time trying to become immersed in the world of ancient and modern Stoicism.
Well, Dr. Vost, thank you for joining the podcast.
My pleasure, Steve. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you. Carpe diem.
Exactly.